human rights, and indeed so many other critical issues that face our world today. In fact, extraordinary is perhaps the wrong word to describe this trend. Direct city-to-city coordination is emerging and maturing and becoming wonderfully ordinary. Why? Why is this happening? The answer is that urbanization is the most consequential force shaping our political order in this century. It is undoubtedly the most dynamic force. More than 500 cities around the world now have a population of more than 1 million people. And yet that statistic alone does not quite capture the staggering pace at which cities are growing. In 1950, 1/3 of the world lived in urban areas. Today, well over half do. By 2050, it will be over 2/3, 6.3 billion people who will live and work in urban areas. At this very moment, a Chicago-sized city is being added to the world's population every 2 weeks. And that's why we need to engage the new people who are moving to cities and being born there, the next generation, about the power and promise and the challenges and capabilities that cities have is now even more important. And therefore, we're delighted today to have so many young professionals with us, including 32 students from global universities all around the world. Cities also hold great economic power, greater than ever. 80% of the world's economic output comes from cities. But so too do more than 70% of the greenhouse gases that are being emitted in the world. Politically and culturally, cities are the vanguards of openness, the champions of globalization, important qualities in a time when nationalist and anti-globalist sentiments are re-emerging. Taken together, what these trends means is clear. A future dominated by cities is rapidly becoming our present. And so, as we have done in the previous 2 years, we're gathered in this global city here in Chicago to discuss the essential role of global cities in a changing world. But this year, in some ways, is different from previous years. The questions we hope to answer over the next few days are entirely new, and for good reason. Where previously we asked if cities drive the global economy, now we ask how they will continue to do so. Before we asked if cities could have a foreign policy. Now we're more interested in the examples of cities' diplomacy doing it at their best. Before we asked whether cities could challenge national governments for political power on the global stage, today we know they are. We want to know how they will continue to do so and to better the lives of the citizens of our cities. There are many ways to start. In fact, the Council has just released a new report that outlines the priorities for Chicago's global strategy. That report, which is available outside, is a great resource for leaders from Chicago and from other global cities on how to organize ourselves in the many ideas that we have heard and learned not only from Chicago but by traveling around the world and by having the forum like this about how we can meaningfully and create an actionable agenda for global change. I encourage you all to download and read the task force report at your leisure. We also have copies available of a special report on cities that the Financial Times published today. Many of the journalists who are here with us are either moderating or participating in the panels over the next few days, and they have contributed to the special section. Of course, none of this happens by accident. It takes a small city to organize this Global City Forum. On behalf of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and the Financial Times, I would like to, first of all, to thank all of the speakers who are joining us here today, more than 50 from all corners of the world. We're able to be here today as well in this wonderful setting in which mayors and architects and CEOs, educators and journalists and people and all of you are gathered because forward-thinking corporations and organizations believe that global issues addressed here today are critical. They're right, and we're glad that they are with us here. I want to thank, therefore, our sponsors, lead sponsors, AbbVie and UL, of course, also our supporting sponsors, Grant Thornton, Hyatt Hotels Foundation, Motorola Solutions, United Airlines, and USG Corporation, and our foundation sponsor, the Robert McCormick Foundation. Thanks to all of you for your support. I also want to thank our international and civil partners who have made possible the richness of the content of the next few days. None of this is possible without your presence and your support. Finally, I want to thank the 500 delegates who are joining us here over the next few days from more than 36 countries. You've made the trek to Chicago. We gave you the nice weather, which comes free. You don't have to pay for that, and it's part of what we do here in the Council, but we're very pleased to have you. Thank you as well for everyone who's watching us online. Remember, tweet early and often. The hashtag is GlobalCities2017. We're set to begin what I'm sure will be an important series of discussions and conversations. It's our hope that what is said here carries over after the forum to enrich discussions in other global cities here in Chicago and around the world. Before we start, however, I also want to take a moment to remember Benjamin Barber, a friend and a partner who worked with us on cities and passed away earlier this year. Ben was a pioneering leader on thinking about the roles of cities play in the world today. Insights he shared in best-selling books and on this very stage during our inaugural forum 2 years ago. I think he would have enjoyed the program we have planned for you. Now it's my great pleasure to welcome the U.S. Managing Editor of the Financial Times, our partner in this endeavor for the past 3 years, Gillian Tett.
Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the event. I'd like to echo Ivo's welcome and say that we at the FT are absolutely delighted to be participating in this event. I've always known that Ivo is a very powerful, influential, effective man. I didn't know that he could also control the weather gods. But this is actually the 3rd year that we've had perfect weather. So 3 out of 3 is a pretty good score. And it's great because it really does show Chicago, the fantastic city of Chicago, off to its great advantage. And it provides a perfect frame to talk about these incredibly serious issues. As Ivo says, talking about cities right now is very, very important. That's partly because of the great T word, Donald Trump. We live in an era where cities are suddenly being asked, as of the plan released a few days ago, to carry a lot of the burden of infrastructure, a lot of the burden of economic generation, regeneration, and growth. We live in an era where quite inadvertently the administration has put the cities and states at the very heart of the climate change debate. We also live at a time when the question of immigration and the question of how different communities can or cannot live together is absolutely crucial. And cities are, once again, at the center of that. And last but not least, we also live at a time when the question of how we find effective leadership, how we find politicians that people can actually believe in these very fragmented times, is also absolutely center stage. And we were having a discussion in the green room just before coming on here and talking about which politicians we did or did not admire across the Western stage, somewhat relevant given the current UK election. And what became clear is that many people look to city leaders as people that they can actually trust in these troubled times. So the T word Trump has put cities onto the center stage, but even without Donald Trump, if you can remember a world without Donald Trump, cities are incredibly important and growing in importance for all the reasons that Ivo has just said. So it's the 3rd year the FT has been involved with this. We are absolutely delighted to be involved with this because so many of these themes are central to the stories that are on our pages every day. We take pride in the fact we can cover these issues and cover these debates well. So well, in fact, that if you are already a subscriber to the Financial Times, you'll know that we have a special supplement which has come out today on the question of the future of cities. If you're not a subscriber to the FT yet, we have also, I might have to tell you, a special promotional deal, which is that we have a newsletter talking about the discussions we're going to be having for the next 3 days. And you can actually get a 3-month free trial subscription to the FT through that. That's my one commercial plug. But otherwise, as Ivo said, we're going to have several FT journalists in the group in the next few days. Myself, Ed Luce, who is our chief US commentator, Jamil Andolini, who's our Asia managing editor. We have the mighty Martin Wolf, our chief economics commentator, and we also have Andrew Edgecliffe-Johnson, who is our US news editor. So we would love to have a chance to talk to as many of you as possible about these key issues. And we just hope that you very much enjoy the debate, create an interesting set of stories for us to write about, and hopefully for you to read about. And to kick us off, and I can't think of a better way to start this whole discussion, we're going to begin with a panel called Open Cities, Closed Borders, a Response to Globalization. In the supplement published today, we have a column by Martin Wolf, which starts, "The world's great cities are inherently dynamic and diverse. They are also naturally open to the world. So how should they respond if their countries seek to close themselves against outsiders? How should they view their responsibilities to the world?" That indeed is one of the great questions of the age, and so I look forward to the next panel to hear some answers. Thank you.
Your moderator, Ivo Daalder, and the Open Cities, Closed Borders, a Response to Globalization panel.
There you go, okay. Oh, that's nice. Don't know what I've got.
Well, Gillian, thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's welcome again. Good to see you here. I'm joined here today with some very important voices where we can have a good discussion about the question of where cities are heading in an age of globalization, which is in some ways competing with the way in which our international system has been organized for the past 400 years. An international system based on the interaction of nation states. And increasingly, we're seeing that globalization is posing real questions for not the viability of nation states, but how do nation states cooperate internationally? How do they deal with the challenges that we all face? And how do cities, perhaps as subnational entities, offer an opportunity to coordinate and to cooperate in dealing with these with these challenges and offer solutions? We have with us practitioners and thinkers, journalists and politicians to ask these kinds of questions. People who have served at high levels of government, people who have not served in these high levels. People have served nationally and internationally and at local levels. Let me start. We have John Tory, the mayor of Toronto since 2014. It's great to have you here with us today. Martin Wolf, who is the chief economics commentator at the Financial Times and has already been cited in the kickoff here. Eduardo Paes, who is the former mayor of Rio de Janeiro, including during the 2016 Summer Olympics, and the former chairman of the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group. Helen Clark, former Prime Minister of New Zealand, former administrator of the UN Development Program, and Carl Bildt, former Foreign Minister and Prime Minister of Sweden. We're going to have a discussion here. First, I really want to talk about this fundamental question of governing a world where political power of cities is really not commensurate with their economic and cultural power. And Martin, let me start with you because you wrote in the special section that the Financial Times put out today, which I hope if you haven't had a chance to look at it, please do. From your perspective, what has the past year revealed to you about the changing global order
and the role that cities are playing in this.
And so first of all, thank you for the question. And before I answer it, it's a great pleasure to be back here in Chicago and particularly involved with a program we're running with you. I've always enjoyed enormously being involved with the Global Council. So the start is, how many hours do I have? But obviously, the last year has taught us that we are in a pretty spectacular mess as in the West as far as globalization is concerned, and quite particularly in the United States and the United Kingdom, which I suppose one would have regarded as the heartlands of international liberalism, defined in the English sense of the term liberalism, not the American one. And of course, these are not the only countries in which populist backlashes against globalization of various kinds have become significant. They dodged a bullet in France. It's still very plausible that Cinque Stelle will become the biggest party in Italy. And that could have very big consequences. So I think we have to ask ourselves what's going on and what does it mean for the cities? The answer, I think, is that we are now living in a period of pretty extreme political fragility in the important parts of the Western world, and the most important parts I mentioned. And that's because we have not succeeded in persuading quite a large part of our populations that the global order as it evolved has worked to their benefit. And in my view, manipulative and irresponsible politicians have, as you would expect, because that's their profession, as it were, to have exploited this. And the particular form of exploitation takes the form of a return to tribalism. I mean, tribal identities linked around ethnicity and nationality, and which are obviously by their very nature hostile to globalization and hostile to the idea of an open society in its many different respects. Why has this happened? I don't think it's particularly surprising. We've had rising inequality. We've had stagnant real wages, particularly in the last 10 years. We had a gigantic financial crisis from which, in the view of many citizens, and rightly so, the bankers themselves were saved and they weren't. And they don't see that this is going to get better. One of the things that's surprising, I think very revealing in both the US and UK, is so many people don't think the future for their children will be better than their own. So this is, I think, the context. Now, what does it mean now for the challenges for cities? Well, in some way, and I've been thinking very much about my own country, I won't go in very long, but somehow the Brexit referendum captured this stress between the growing tribalism in the nation and the outward-looking metropolis of London. London's population, just under 40% of the population of London is foreign-born. So it's the place where there are incredibly large number of immigrants, and yet it voted very, very strongly to remain. It's completely relaxed about this. It's open, its links to the world are colossal and pervasive. It is in some ways the antithesis of the movement which led to Brexit. But of course, the people who voted for Brexit in significant ways were voting against London. They were voting against the very thing it embodied, even though, not paradoxically, but not surprisingly, actually London is an enormous source of net fiscal transfers to the country. So by depriving London of its position in Europe, which I think they're doing, they will greatly impoverish themselves. But the resentments being built up are such that they're choosing policies are being chosen at the national level, which impoverish themselves because of the resentments that a city like London creates, and I think there are very similar things in other societies. That, I think, I won't go any further now, creates immense challenges at the national level and at the city level. I don't personally believe cities can escape from their national context, but they have to be aware of the national context in which they are operating, and I think a core element is this return of tribalism, of particular sorts of tribalism, which has been shown so clearly in the results, the Brexit vote, the presidential election here in the US, and may be shown in other things. So we have enormous challenges to confront.
Helen, take us from there. You've been a national leader, you've been a local leader, you've been an international leader, but just staying with the local and the national for a moment. Cities are often characterized, and Martin just did, the non-big cities have a sense of the cities having too much power, too much influence, too much say over what is going on. They tend to be viewed as elitist, out of touch. Where does this perception come from? Why is it occurring, and what can we do about it? Because even if it's true, it's not a very healthy way in which to live.
Well, I think there's often a tendency to have polarization between the centre and the periphery in any society, particularly between a large dominant city and even smaller cities, let alone the rural hinterland. And I think what we're seeing happen, as Martin's described, is this now having an overlay of globalization being seen to have favoured the cities, but not so much favoured perhaps the secondary cities and where the industry's left, rural areas which are feeling neglected. So that exacerbates what is often a traditional tension. Now, I think also for the periphery, there's the issue of the scale of the cities vis-a-vis them. Big somehow becomes bad. There's also often a perception that a city is a dangerous place, and maybe some tragic recent events bear that out for many. There's the fact that because of the scale of the cities, they tend to have more political power in the national legislatures or federal legislatures as well. So this also builds up the resentment. So if this big place, or these big places are just seen as doing better than I am in my smaller place on the periphery, that creates antagonism. Now, on the issue of elitism, I think it's also then easy to trash the cities as the places where the pointy heads are, the universities, the academics. What do they know about anything? It's where the big media centres are, and it's been interesting to see how populism has also very much taken on attacking the media and almost linking that to the large urban phenomenon. Arts and culture are there. Again, that can be represented as pointy-headed. And then I think also the cities give space for the expression of more liberal values than one often finds in a hinterland. So the multiculturalism, the space for feminism, the space for LGBTI rights to be expressed, the space for the political left, which may not be found in the hinterland. So for all of these reasons, I think we're in a time and place where the traditional centre-periphery divide is exacerbated. What we can do about it, of course, is a much, much harder issue, but I think for national governments, and I think for political tendencies that are very concerned about the nationalism and the populism we're seeing at the moment, the issue is really how to run economic and social policies which are more inclusive so you don't set up these divisions. That, to me, is the core issue. How do we become more cohesive, more inclusive in the way our countries are run and governed?
We'll come back to this issue of how the city and the periphery can come together more and share in the benefits of openness. But staying for a moment with the city, and I want to turn to John Tory, global cities in particular, and yours being one of them, proclaim that they are open to the world. It's, as Martin said, almost 40% of London's population is foreign-born. I believe in your city it's even larger than that.
51.
That's 51%. So they are open, but then they're also not particularly open in some ways. In some ways, they are leaving even people within their own cities behind. What are the tensions that are playing out in a global city like that?
Well, they're different kinds of, I wouldn't even describe them as, I guess they're tensions of a sort, but they're not the kind of tribal tensions necessarily. But I think the challenge that's in front of us is you don't want them to develop into that. I mean, Canada has been fortunate in that our sort of shared values that are pretty broadly shared across the country, including in the big cities, especially I think they're rooted in the big cities where we do have 51% of the population born outside the country, that we've somehow managed to have people feel accepted and embraced. And if there's a tension, it's not as between people of different nationalities or skin colors or sexual orientation or faith. But if there are challenges that are in front of us that could lead to tensions, and where there are some, I'm not trying to pretend we've achieved perfection by any means. I will say, by the way, that in the context of the periphery and the core, I am probably the single greatest unifying feature in Canada, in that I'm the mayor of Toronto, the largest and most disliked city in the country by everybody that's outside of it. So I consider that my contribution to national unity. But the tensions are about inclusion versus non-inclusion. And the fact is that if you look at the people who are not fully integrated and not fully included in the economy or the political or the social life of the city where I live, or of parts of the country, mostly urban, they tend to disproportionately be people who have come from somewhere else. And it's a practical problem to resolve. It's not because anybody's trying to exclude them. It's simply because we've been working hard at developing the language courses and the transition courses. I mean, the level of education of the people who are choosing to come to Canada is higher than the people who are already there. And yet, when they come to Toronto or to Canada and seek to get recognition for their educational or professional credentials they've had, it's very difficult. And some of that is, I'm sure, by design of professions that don't admit it, but put up certain barriers to entry. So we're developing transition courses. We're developing, kind of community hubs in the neighborhoods where these people live to avoid tension arising from a lack of inclusion. We're working hard at things as simple as language courses. I mean, how can anybody become fully included if they can't speak one of our two official languages at all? So we're working at that, but it is, if you said to me, well, where is the strain and where is the challenge for us? That's where it is, as opposed to the kind of tribal, more tribal roots of some tensions that exist elsewhere in the world. We just went through now again, we don't have refugees, coming on foot sort of across the border or in boats, but we took a very open approach. And when it was put forward by leaders, including myself, that we should be open based on all of our past experiences with refugees, this was not a subject of any particular debate in the country. Now, I will say we didn't have the same pressures that countries, say, in Europe would have, but it's just symptomatic of the attitude and the values, but we still have a challenge with inclusion.
Brazil has different challenges, and I want to go to Mayor Paes. There's an urban-rural challenge, and then which is in some ways affecting policy and policy making, and even voting behavior in Brazil. How has this manifested itself? Is there a populism that comes with that rural-urban difference and the challenge of the rapid changes that are happening in the urban areas in Brazil?
Well, it's always, obviously, there's always going to be a difference when we speak from the global north and then we come to the global south. I mean, I would like to go back a little bit in Brazilian history, because I mean, now we're going through a crazy period in Brazilian politics. But if you look like 2, 3, 4 years ago, the country was doing great. If you look at the past 2 decades, 10 years, inequality has become smaller. I mean, things were getting better. The economy was doing well. And then we had, and why would I like to go back a little? Because in 2013, we had lots of protests. I mean, it was the best moment of the country. The economy was growing, almost no unemployment, and Brazil, finally the country of the future, had become a great country. And then everyone went out on the streets and everyone was protesting against the politicians. I mean, like in front of the city hall, I had like 500,000 people. It was very nice to have so many people in front of the city hall protesting. There was always the issue about the World Cup, the Olympics, and this and that. But by the end, what I think, and that's something that I think it's come between the global south and the global north, I think we face a big problem, which is the model of the representative democracy. I mean, we still choose our leaders in the same way we did centuries ago. I mean, obviously, it got better. Women are voting. There's no more slaves. You know, it become open. But there's this. People have more information. People have more access to politicians. What we do, and this has become a thing that I think, when you look at cities, it can mean a big difference between rural areas and the cities. I mean, I like to call it Polish digitocracy. I mean, I think we are coming to a point, and that's an adaptation. We are here a generation of people that has to go through this adaptation. But we're coming to a point where cities are the place where maybe direct democracy can come back. I mean, people are always wanting to discuss. People in 2013, they did not go out in the streets of Brazil to complain about the services because they were better than they were before. Obviously, it can always get better. People were complaining against its lack of representation. And this in cities can make a big difference. Again, at this first moment, and I'm optimistic about what's going to happen in the near future. As everywhere else, if you look at Latin America, the most urbanized continent in the world, if you look at South America especially, you're going to see lots of populism. Comes from the left. I don't want to say bad things about Venezuela, but comes from the left, comes from the right, it comes from everywhere. But by the end, I think this is a transition period, and I think cities will play a major role of fighting against this populism. So I see cities and the way cities can change representative democracy. I see cities as a great machine to change what's going on.
Carl, I want to talk a little bit about Sweden, but also talk about go beyond that. I mean, Sweden has in many ways gone through all of these stages, large refugee populations, both in the 90s and again in recent years. So the inclusion dynamic has been one. The social and economic dynamic has changed over time, where the difference between city and non-city has not been as great. Perhaps as it could have been in certainly in the countries like perhaps the UK and the US. Reflect a little bit on that, but then also as a part of a transition to not only where are we, but what can we do about it? What are sort of the challenges that big cities are facing that really cities are better placed to tackle than the nation state per se?
Well, I mean, first I think, which is to state the obvious, it's not a question of the cities or nation states or global organizations or whatever. It has to be all of them. But of course, cities are becoming, needless to say, more important. If we talk about mega trends in global development, I think there are two mega trends that are going to be dominant. One is digitalization. We are at the end of the industrial age. We are at the beginning of the digital age. That is going to shape everything in the decades and possibly even centuries ahead. We are, in terms of technology, roughly where the industrial age was with the second generation steam engine. So that's going to be enormously important. That one obvious megatrend. The other one is urbanization. We can talk about sort of divide between rural areas or peripheries and cities, but the fact all across the world is that people are moving into cities. I think I heard you saying that 2/3 of the global population is going to be in cities. And particularly if you see, we could talk about Sweden or Canada or Brazil or New Zealand, but if you look at Africa, what's going to happen there? Enormous cities are going to be created. And it's not that sort of politicians are forcing people to go into cities. It's like people find that even if things can be difficult in cities, which they can be, they prefer life there for X numbers of different reasons. So essentially is then to find solutions for cities in cities. And that will have to be done with the sort of the different backgrounds that are there in the different countries. Obviously, sort of Congo is slightly different from Sweden in X numbers of respects, but I mean, some of the issues are going to be the same if we look at it long term. Issues that needs to be addressed and have to be addressed on the city level. just to take a couple of them. The digital issues, we're going to see the impact of them more profoundly on the city level. Takes issues like sort of transportation systems and what can be done there with automation and self-driving and things like that. I think I have a figure, but that's not Stockholm, that's Los Angeles, that roughly a third of the area of Los Angeles is taken up by the highways or parking places, parking spots. If you sort of take away the cars and have them automated and shared, it transforms the urban landscape. That's going to happen in cities. And there, we talk about cities in Mumbai, to take another sort of fairly big place. They're going to catch up very fast with the digital age. So the divide that we might see now between the Toronto and Mumbai is going to be far less in a couple of decades. That's one issue. The other one, very much debated these days, is of course all of the sustainability, energy issues, obviously. We're probably going to return to that. And another one, not to be forgotten, are the security issues. Because we can talk about sort of threat of terrorism and things like that, and what national police forces do and things like that. But at the end of the day, local policing and security is very local. And the way in which you organize, to take one example without going into details and without insulting too many people, the difference in a country like Belgium, that's one nation state. But the difference in which they organize police forces and security forces in Brussels and in Antwerp, completely different systems and completely different effects in terms of the security that they are able to provide. And here cities do it, and cities do it differently, and here need to learn. Sweden, a happy, nice country up in the north. It has to be said that once upon a time, and it still might be the case, there are probably more people of Swedish ancestry living in Chicago than in most of, probably sort of in all of Sweden, but certainly in Stockholm. So we had a time when sort of life in Sweden was perhaps less glorious, and people thought Chicago was better. Whether that is still the case, I don't know. We have gone through major challenges, of course, in development as well, in terms of urbanization and depopulation of the rural areas. The biggest change that we had was the mechanization of forestry. We should not forget that sort of not too many decades ago, a lot of people were living on farms and they were doing forestry and they were doing logging. There were no machines, and they were doing this year round. Then machines appeared in the 50s and the 60s. And large parts of Sweden were virtually depopulated, and they moved into the urban areas. There was an amount of tension there, but we sorted that out. Then we've had, as you alluded to, immigration. The figures that we have are slightly different from the Toronto figures, where you said that people that are coming to Toronto or Canada have a higher level of education than those that are there. Yeah, but has something to do with the Canadian system, has to be said. Our system is really that we are open to refugees. And they are coming often with an education. Not always. There are certain groups that are highly educated and done extremely well. But some of them are coming with very low levels of education. There we do have an integration problem. And we do have a challenge. Have we mastered that fully? No. Have we done it broadly correct? Broadly okay. Yeah, broadly okay. But broadly okay is not enough. Because if you succeed with 80% but fail with 20%, you still got a massive problem. You need to succeed with 95% or something like that, and we aren't there yet. But there's no question that immigration has contributed to the vitality of our cities and the vitality of our economy. So for all of the sort of tendencies in politics to say, take up the drawbridge, that is not going to happen and will not happen.
Thanks, Carl, and all of you. I think we have a diagnosis. The question now is how do we solve it? So let's move to addressing the problems that we see. Martin, starting with you. It seems to me we have this tension on the one hand about the economic and cultural importance of cities on the one hand, and the lack of their political power on the other. You mentioned London versus the periphery and the importance that London was for the entire country. London is a good example. Is there a way it can use its economic clout better to effectuate changes in policy in the nation that are more in line with the way in which London would like to go. We've seen Brexit as one of those examples. Is there a way we could redistribute power from the national level, or where it seems to reside, to cities in order to effectuate change that benefits all?
When I was asked to write the column that appears in our special report, it forced me to go back to think about some questions that have interested me for a large part of my life, about long period history. And the two I thought that it is relevant to this. I've been profoundly persuaded by the work of Jane Jacobs, who I regard as a genius, who I was privileged to know, that cities were the great invention of the Neolithic era. And of course they were very small by contemporary standards. But economic progress has always occurred in cities. It's not new, it has always occurred in cities. In fact, she puts forward a wonderful argument, which I think is completely persuasive. I'm sure scholars are debating it, that cities even invented agriculture. We can discuss that. But it's a completely persuasive argument, by the way. She was a genius. Don't underestimate her. Anyway, the point is that when cities formed in the early period of human development, many of them were also political entities. So the city-state is not just an episode. At the very beginning in Sumeria, for example, city-states were a dominant entity. So city power and power were the same thing. And of course in the West, very unlike Asia, city-states have played a simply staggering role in our cultural development, from Athens through Rome, through Italy, and so forth. And then I started thinking about how did this change? Because today, really and truly, Singapore is the only city-state of any independence. All the cities we're talking about, even ones of immense scale, I mean, city regions which generate, in some cases, close to half of the GDP of their country, are nonetheless embedded in countries, in territories. And the most powerful states in the world, the ones that, and the reason we emphasize them, because they shape the world system, like the US or China or India, are of a scale that dwarfs even their cities. So political power ended up in countries which contain often many cities and whose interests are often, as expressed in their political systems, very separate from those of their global cities, whose economic role, in my view, is as dominant as ever, and their political role is remarkably insignificant. Now, so what do we do about this? I don't think it is plausible that the cities which lack armies and lack, on the whole, tribal loyalties, which I rather like, are going to rise up and say, give us independence. I wrote a column once for the FT in which I argued, and I believe it passionately, by the way, that it would be a very good thing if London became Singapore, if it became an independent city-state. But I do not expect the British government to accede to that, and I don't even expect the English people to accede to that, even most Londoners. So we're not going to have political independence. We're not going to be able, therefore, to frame the legal environment within which all this occurs. That means, one, and I think we don't emphasize this enough in this discussion, we sort of, a lot of these discussions are about, come to the end very quickly, about how the cities should deal with one another. But I have come increasingly to think one of the things the cities have to do is to take the argument to their countries. That is to say, they have to persuade the people who are not living in the great metropolitan cities that their existence benefits them and that they're open to them. And from that point of view, by the way, and this is one big issue which I've fought very hard on in Britain, they have to show that people can come and live in them. And one of the reason people can't live in them is that there's no housing in them. And the housing in almost every major city I know has become so prohibitively expensive as to be unthinkable for most citizens to go and live there unless they want to live in the most extreme squalor. So one thing they have to do, I think, is to get engaged nationally. The other thing, of course, they can do is they can become models of living together in regional harmony and effectiveness among very different people, models of what their countries should become. They can pursue policies which are designed to show that global goals are still achievable. Climate change is an important example of that. They can work hard at the national level, at their level, to show how you integrate people from abroad and also people from other parts of the country. They can become integration machines, and they should, I think, not only cultivate the relationships between one another, but crucially with the city regions of which they're part, so that they try to spread their influence and their opportunities, not just to those who are inside, but the people who are fairly close to them and who feel distant from them. So I think there's quite a complex set of things within this context, without being able to run countries, because they're not going to run them, or run the world, they can probably do to ameliorate the situation in which we find ourselves.
Helen, reflect on what Martin said, because you talked about the difference between the center and the periphery, and Martin is saying the center can't get away from the periphery is part of it, but it can find a way to bring the periphery into the political and economic advantage of the center, the city in this case. Reflect on that, the urban-rural divide that you have, the divide between large and small cities. How do you bring them in? How do you make them feel that, in fact, it is an advantage to be part of this open, cosmopolitan city, rather than to think that, no, we're better off by cutting ourselves off from the rest of the world? What does a practical politician do in order to get that kind of agenda implemented?
Well, because my leadership was at the national level, I tend to also look at it from the point of view of what should national governments be doing, and I come back to the inclusive, non-inclusive dimensions of policy, that I do think national governments have an obligation to try to ensure that the magnets of growth, which are cities, don't monopolise all the prosperity and opportunity in the country. There is a responsibility to try to share prosperity, if you like, more widely than we're seeing. Carl referred to the urbanisation trend, which will see 2/3 of the global population in cities by 2050. And to put that in numbers, if we have a global population of roughly 7.5 billion now, and it's heading for 9.5 to 10 billion by 2050, my understanding is that all of that extra population is going to be absorbed in cities. So cities are going to be bigger, and given the trends we're talking about now, even more powerful. So the role of national governments in trying to spread prosperity, I think, becomes even more accentuated. I absolutely agree with Martin that there are things cities could do to affirm their own value proposition to whole countries, showing the interdependence between periphery and city. How do the goods get out to market? How do people transport themselves in and out of the periphery? It's generally through the major city transit hubs. Where are goods processed? Again, if you're going to be part of a value chain, then what happens in the cities to your goods and services matters a great deal. So I think cities could market a lot more their value and the interlinkages and interdependencies that there are within the national society and economies. Martin's point on housing, I think, is a very, very important one, because we are seeing the global cities become places where only those of considerable means can afford to live. Now, the answer to that will partly lie with the cities and how they zone and the extent to which they have a commitment to social housing and mixed income housing. But there's also a responsibility with central governments, because often these trends of unaffordability have been exacerbated by central governments taking away the level of housing subsidy or whatever support, which enables those who do a lot of the work in the cities, the service workers, to actually be able to live there. So in summary, I think there's responsibilities on national governments, there's responsibilities on cities themselves to sell themselves, and I think that cities can be the model of what we would like our world to be: more inclusive, more tolerant, more accepting, more open, innovative, but we have to have some shared prosperity and benefits from all this.
Thanks very much. Before I go on, I should mention we're going to open up the floor pretty soon, but we'll open it up digitally because we're living in a digital world rather than and virtually. And you've seen on the screen that you can access our web page, cih.cnf.io. If you put that into your browser on your smartphone, you can type in questions there and vote on questions that you think we should ask, and we'll turn to that in a minute. I want to go from the nation to a more international perspective of how cities can cope with these issues. And John Tory, increasingly cities are looking not just to their national governments or even to their peripheries, they're looking to counterparts in other parts of the world to address the problems that they face in order to find solutions. You're active in something that you've called urban diplomacy as an initiative. Describe what it is that you're trying to do specifically with those issues and the impact you're seeing as it relates to the overcoming some of the divisions and tensions that you find in your own city and society.
Happy to address that. I just want to go back to the previous question for 1 second to say that one thing we did in very practical political terms just in the most recent Canadian election was that the big cities had a caucus of the biggest cities, which represented a huge proportion of the members of parliament, and we put all of the parties put their feet to the fire, and we maintained unity between and among ourselves about getting them back into housing and transit in a meaningful way, and it was very successful because they couldn't avoid us. We were together, we represented together 80% of the population of the country, and so it wasn't so much about trying to convince anybody in the outlying areas of the cities of the merits of our case. It was a matter of convincing the politicians who we were electing. Yeah. And it worked very well. It was a straightforward, practical, political, and because we stayed united on it, it worked very well. Now, on the question you asked, we have the good fortune in Canada, again, where a lot of what we would do, even through the urban diplomacy, is, I think cities should be, in an ideal world, supporting the national ambitions of their country. There should be a consistency between the two, and I think on things like, open trade, climate change, open immigration, and so on, we actually have the good fortune that most of the cities in the country, in fact, I might even say all of them, have views and values and aspirations that are consistent with the national aspirations in that regard. But I think that the urban diplomacy today, to me, has a lot more to do with the practical delivery of services and the solution of some of the problems that I talked about and we've all talked about, whether it is housing and transit, whether it's integration of people, who integrates refugees? I mean, national governments may set policies about how many are being taken and that sort of thing. Who integrates them? Cities do. Who builds public transportation? Who actually fixes the environment? In large measure in terms of the practical day-to-day energy retrofitting of buildings, building of public transportation to get cars off the roads. Do people invest in cities or do they invest in countries? I mean, I think that there's no hard and fast rule to that, but by and large today, they're investing in city regions, not in countries. And so, to me, the advantage of this urban diplomacy is simply that I don't mean this to be disrespectful of our national government or anybody else's or our provincial governments. They are ripping us off when it comes to the fact that we have those responsibilities and we don't have the ability, we are subservient and don't have the ability even to raise the money necessary to do the things we're responsible for doing. But I'm going to learn more from a meeting with Rahm Emanuel today in Chicago or from sitting with the Mayor of Jerusalem as I did on Monday night in Toronto about all of those things I just mentioned, to be quite frank, that I'm going to learn from meeting with most people in the national government or in other national governments, because they're not actually delivering these services on a day-to-day basis. We are. And so you can learn from talking to anybody, but I find that the urban diplomacy allows us the opportunity, as we had this morning, as we're having tonight, to sit in a room with people who have like responsibilities and compare how you're doing it, because that's where the rubber hits the road on almost every one of these issues. Not interest rates and not foreign policy, but on everything else that matters to people and our ability to include and integrate them and make them whole in the context of our country or any other. It's in cities.
Eduardo, let me, a good segue to your experience as the head of C40. Take that one example of climate and sustainability, where cities in the last 5 to 6 years have really come together because they are the ones who are responsible for they're both responsible for the problem, and to some extent, but really responsible for its solution. Can you talk a little bit about how you cooperated together, how you tried to influence national governments on these issues, because that's a key issue too, but then how you learned to take John Tory's point, learning from other cities in a practical way in order to achieve real results.
I mean, it was good that John Tory spoke before me, because we could make a sweet transition here. But I mean, Barbara was cited here earlier when you made the presentation. I mean, all power to the mayors. I mean, I'm going to talk a little bit about C40, but there is, and I'm not a mayor anymore, so I'm leaving office, so I'm not looking for more. I left office, so I'm not looking for more power here. But by the end of the day, who is close, remember what I said first. I mean, there's a problem with the representative democracy. I mean, which level of government is living the everyday problems of the people, which is the level of government that is dealing more and more with the issues that really matters to people. I mean, when people listen to, and I don't think we need to get rid of national governments. I mean, that would be impossible. But there needs to be a transition there. There needs to be a change there where, for example, most of the revenues, most of the taxes, they don't go to the central governments. I mean, that's something that's a model that it's not working anymore, and it will keep not working. So we need to decentralize. We need to give more power to mayors. They are, and again, the world is going to become urbanized because the cities are a fantastic experience. People like to live in cities, and that's why the world is becoming more and more urbanized. So, and we proved that in institutions like C40. I mean, talk a little bit about urban city diplomacy, whatever. So I remember that was created almost 15 years ago, but I remember in 2012 we had this, that's the picture there. I mean, I know where it's up here. We had this Earth Summit in Rio. It was 20 years after Rio 92, Eco 92. And I mean, national states that got together in Rio, no decision. I mean, they could not agree on certain commas or periods on the text. And so mayors got together, and there are common actions that Rio could copy from Toronto, and New York could copy from Chicago, and I mean, a bunch of great experiences. And when you look at the figures, I mean, cities could do 40% of the task that is ahead of us concerning climate change. I mean, when we went to Paris, there was an agreement. It seems that there's not this agreement anymore. Let's pick at this moment here, when President Trump just went last week and said, okay, we are out of the Paris Agreement. I mean, I can guarantee you that the United States is capable, obviously we need their business also, but it's capable of delivering what was the Paris Agreement if mayors, and I know the American mayors are very committed to that, if mayors get together and get things done. So I really believe that there is going to be a point, in spite of the fact that we have the mayors don't have any army, in spite of the fact that the diplomacy is different, but there's going to be a point where most of the changes, the world that we want to live in will be run by cities and by mayors, and they're going to play a major role. They're going to get more strength, and that's why I'm optimistic about the world. That's why I really believe that things are going to get better. That some of the things, especially Martin said here, we're going through a transition. And I think this transition will get to mayors to be more powerful, local governments to be more powerful, and the changes will be stronger.
So I want to go back to where Martin started, Carl, and which is the slightly less optimistic version of the one that Eduardo just put on the table, the increasing fragility, but more importantly, that our national politics and our cosmopolitan city politics are diverging. In some ways, in some places. Certainly, we saw that in the Brexit vote in the UK. We saw it in the vote here in our country. One argue either side of that equation, but if you believe there is at least some division between the national politics we're seeing and the way big cities are approaching the problems, how do we overcome that problem? Because we're not going to have independent city-states. I think that's probably a given. How do we make sure that our national politics continue to have the open markets, the open borders, the open minds, and the open societies that we used to have in our Western politics, at least, which now seem to be moving in a different direction? How do we have cities and nations come together in the right way? Or is this something that is just a transition phase? We shouldn't worry about it all that much. Politics will take care of it, which is I think where Eduardo was coming from. How do you see it?
Well, of course, everything is in transition phase, the one way or the other, because we are in transition from where we are to where we are going. So from that point, yes, we are in a transition phase. You are right on that, Ivo. But we are in a bigger transition phase, to repeat that particular phrase. If you look at particularly from the European point of view, the development of our political institutions in a perspective of a couple of centuries, we've been living through the era of the nation state, when that has been dominant. More and more power has been concentrated in the nation states. And that's from the French Revolution and onwards, or something like that. Then what is needed now is obviously, the nation state is still very important, needless to say. It is the number one focus of the political cultures of our different parts of the world, no question about that. And we've seen that reflected in a number of elections. But we see that there is a need for more powers on the regional, be that European, be that Latin American, or be that the global level, things that needs to be sorted out, global trade, sustainability, and those sorts of things. That wasn't that prominent if we go back a couple of decades. And there's a need to devolve powers more. There's a demand for that from people. And there's also a need because slightly different problems needs to be addressed in slightly different ways. And that means that we do have that tension with the nation states being perhaps slightly in retreat, not as dominant as they were, but still dominant in the perception of people. We see that in elections, obviously. But need for more regional autonomy or cities autonomy or diverse solutions. And I think this, to a certain extent, Ivo, is one way of sorting out the problem that we indicate, these tensions that could be there. Because at the end of the day, what people want is for cities or nations or whatever to sort out the problems that they have, to meet the demand that is there for security or public services or jobs or whatever. And having the appropriate political structure is, I think, key to making that possible. And that political structures will have to be slightly different in the future than what was dominating at least European development for, say, 200 years or something like that, up until now. To some extent, being slightly philosophical, I was inspired by Martin and his thesis of agriculture being invented in cities. I remain to be convinced about that. But the importance of cities historically, look at prior to the era of the nation state in Europe. It was a much looser arrangement in Europe. Few people have heard about the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation that was there for 1,000 years, very, very loose. And under that, cities, not only northern Italy in the Renaissance, but take something in my part of the world, the Hanseatic League, for a couple of 100 years. It was different cities, but they were united by the same rules for commerce and trading routes and developing technologies and things like that. These were fairly glorious periods in terms of development. But it was looser on that particular on that particular level, heavier on a lower level. And I think we are returning to that.
But the challenge here, in a governance sense, is that you have global challenges that in fact require global cooperation, and cities are not participating in that level of governance.
No,
and that's in some ways the challenge that we face. And how can we overcome that? Is there a way in which the governance structure, so one is to devolve power down, but in some ways it's also taking the power that is gained below and bring it up to the UN level, to the international level, to the European Union level. And so that in some ways international organizations, global organizations need to become open to non-national voices, if not non-national votes. I think that's where the tension is starting to come. And C40 in some ways started to do that.
That's happening.
Yeah, that's happening. I mean, if you look at what happened in the Paris, in Rio meeting, the United Nations, these mayors are meeting there, let's not pay attention to what they're doing. I mean, when you look at Paris, it was a completely different environment. I was kind of afraid because I said if the UN bureaucracy get into the mayors, that they might, get us into trouble. But again, it's a way of, getting closer to the reality. So I think institutions are much more open to mayors now.
Let me, Martin, please, and then I'll get to some of the questions.
I think that part of this fits very well with the sort of the crisis view, which is if you think about openness as the openness and some sense of the sharing of the world as where we want to go, then the logical consequence is that a world, well, I would go back to Westphalia, but it doesn't really matter. A world in which sovereignty is, quote unquote, absolute, and that's obviously, and is concentrated in nation states, which are structures designed for obedience and for war, let's be quite clear. And that concept, which is clearly what has returned in the Brexit vote and in the last election here, there's no doubt about it. That's what's returned, because it's what happens when you're frightened. That's what it happens when you're frightened. That's one conception, which seems to me absolutely the wrong conception. It is not the way we can continue. The right way, if we are to continue as a species, I think, well and successfully, we have to diffuse that notion, which is a modern notion. Carl is absolutely right. This is not how it always was. And into a notion in which power is distributed horizontally and starting at the global level, so we do things at the global level that have to be done at the global level, and all the way down to real localities. For the nation state and those who rely on the nation state to look after them, this concept is terrifying. So I think we are, but I have absolutely no doubt it's where we have to go. And I'm increasingly convinced of this. The European Union was a great attempt to achieve that. That is one of the reasons I find the Brexit vote so horrifying. And in some ways, the United States viewed as a federal state is a great attempt to do this. But the question is, can we make this complex transition to a world in which power is divided horizontally in this way, which once it's done allows cities, of course, to combine with other cities to share problems. It's a different way of organizing the world. If we don't organize the world that way, I think we will destroy ourselves.
Let me go to some of the questions that have been asked, and one of it is on the role of the private sector, which we've really focused on sort of the public sector here, but the role of the private sector, which in some ways is also not bound by national, boundaries. How can the private sector be a force to help address part of these problems? I mean, we'll have to rely on the private sector being a key part of the economic driving force. But the question is, what's the role of the private sector in making the case for cities becoming more powerful, as well as to stimulate inclusive growth? Helen, you want to take that on, and then maybe Carl?
actually also perhaps incorporating into it the way in which cities are adopting the global agendas, because we've got two pretty significant ones that have come out of 2015. One, of course, the Paris Climate Agreement, and the other, the Agenda 2030 on Sustainable Development. And neither of these agreements are going to be implemented unless cities do a lot of the heavy lifting because of the size and scale of the global cities in the world economy. So while cities aren't represented at the UN level, certainly without cities being active, nothing much is going to happen. Now, allied to that, we have seen, I think, very, very encouraging trends in the interest of the global private sector in these global agendas. I mean, go to a climate change conference of parties every year, as I have for the last 8 years. The global private sector is there, and constructively there. You know, you may get some criticism from NGOs about greenwash and the rest of it. I don't buy it. I see the global private sector leaders very, very engaged with these agendas. So maybe there's some, you know, natural alliances there between the global cities, the global private sector, seeing that there's things that just have to be done to move with the times, make a contribution. And if governments are opting out for a while, I think the momentum is going to carry on because the leadership in the cities and the global private sector will carry it through.
Carl, did you want to jump in?
Well, I think it's going to happen automatically that business is going to be a driver of this. If you look at what's happening now with the digital development, I mean, the things that we talk about, or they talk about at the moment, it's going to be different 5 years from now, is Uber and Airbnb. Mm-hmm. These are urban phenomena. And of course, if you are the leadership of Airbnb or Uber, you look at cities, be that Chicago, or be that Shanghai, or be that Stockholm, and you look at it from that Airbnb the same. And of course, if you are in the business of agricultural machinery, you might have a slightly different perspective. But otherwise, they will see these developments and they will compare the markets and they will look at opportunities irrespectively of national borders. They are driving it, and in the digital age, it's going to be faster. John?
Well, and not just the digital age, because all of that innovation is pretty much coming out of the private sector,
yeah,
and I guess the research sector to some extent as well. But same with climate change. I mean, where are the development of the new methodologies, the better methodologies with respect to energy retrofitting or renewable generation? It's going to come from private ingenuity, private capital. And so I think what we have to get over is the fear and anxiety about the private sector. There's a certain fear and anxiety that sets in I'll call it small p political terms, that everybody's going to get ripped off and so on and so on. And I think we have to just remember, governments the one thing they do is they don't have a lot of ingenuity in them when it comes to those kinds of developments of new products and things like that, but they do have the upper hand usually in terms of being able to regulate those things to the extent that's necessary. And so if we can remember that the governments have the upper hand, but then harness the ingenuity of the private sector, I don't think it's an option. You know, when you sort of presented it and said, well, is there a role or should there be a role? We can't possibly cope with the transition to the digital age and to solving problems like climate change without huge leadership, ingenuity, and capital and discipline from the private sector, but properly overseen by those who are put in a position to do so, which is people like us have been and others.
Martin?
I just have I always create difficulties, so I suppose it's my job. I suppose what I feel it's absolutely clear, the private sector capitalism is global. Yeah. Marx wrote about this, actually. And markets naturally go across borders. And we have a very global capitalist system at the moment. And it brings all these benefits we talk about. But it's also seen by many of the people who are angry, and understandably so, which I started with, as the people who've abandoned them, the business that has abandoned them. When Mr. Trump gets on the phone to somebody and says, you shouldn't take your factory to X, it's an ineffective policy, but he surely is responding to a felt need. So I think the job of the private sector is more complex than this. They have to be global, because they are, and they have to see the world globally, but they can't abandon the people of the countries in which they operate and from which they began. Because if they do, they will be seen, and they are seen, as fundamentally disloyal. And this gets into rather complicated questions about what are their responsibilities. Well, I'll give you one answer. One responsibility they have is to pay tax. And so the artifice with which companies, they didn't just exploit the tax system, they created the tax system. Let's be clear, for their benefit. This is absolutely subversive of democratic governments, and it's not tolerable.
I will say, Ivo, that's a big focus on, without getting to the tax issue, on big business, though. But I actually watch in our own city and elsewhere, what's really happening now that I think represents much more of the solution to a lot of the problems that we're talking about in cities is coming from two-person businesses that are starting up and four-person businesses. And I agree, I mean, global capitalism is big businesses that are global by definition, but there's so much more of these small local businesses now where people have sort of figured out it's better to create a job for yourself than it is to know how to get one. Right. And they're just going and doing it. And I think that's part of that transition that was referred to earlier on to the digital age.
It's true. But some of them become global overnight. They do. Even small businesses can be global. That's part of that is a genuine part of the digital revolution.
You gave us two examples here.
It does raise, and there's a final question which I want to pick up from the audience here. It raises the question of leadership. And ultimately, and we have two national leaders and two local leaders. You're never former.
The only one that's in power.
That's power.
Who have experience at the national and the local level.
We've experienced how difficult it is.
Let me rephrase it in that sense. Is the nature of leadership at the local, at cities, does that need to change in some ways? Is the kind of, when it used to be that it came from the bottom and it's sort of, you know, you became a city councilor and then a mayor and then a governor and then a senator and then hopefully the vice president or president of a country. I know a number of who made it that way. Is it different? What kind of leadership do we now need of cities in order to address the kind of questions we've just been discussing here for the last hour plus?
I mean,
aside from the four of you here who I know have the answer, but what should we be looking for in leadership?
I mean, again, I would go to what I said in the beginning. I mean, by the end of the day, I mean, being a leader, being a politician, running for office, it's like, it needs to get closer to people. I think we came to a moment where politicians were too far away from people's realities, and that still is a big problem. And the higher level you go, it will be tougher. So going to the local politics, you know, dealing. I'm not saying you need to go. You need to be a city council member, then a mayor, then a congressman, whatever. Otherwise, President Trump wouldn't be the president of the United States, and that would be a big problem. But the thing about dealing with the everyday life of the people, the experience of the local government, I think makes you become a better leader. Dealing with the everyday life of the people, and that only can come on the city level.
Helen?
Well, I think the leadership of the cities really matters. I think the governance really matters too. I mean, the mega cities, which dwarf a number of the smaller countries, including my own, need to be well governed. They need to be capable. They need to, just to be able to perform as we would expect many of the nation states to do. But I think that leaders in cities need to really be seen in a way as like premiers. They need to set the tone of tolerance and inclusion in their city. They need to set the vision for what the city can be economically and socially. They need to be able to take people with them. They need to practice inclusive governance, participatory governance, and they need to be accountable. So I'm setting quite a high standard, and more than just being the sort of elected chair of the council. It's really somebody who can stand out there and take a vision of where the city can go.
Carl?
No, I think in order to be an effective national leader, I think you need to have an element of local experience, local politics, absolutely. I think that is, I wouldn't say absolutely necessary, but clearly helpful. And you need to have a global perspective, regional, European, or global. That's increasingly important because cities are becoming far more global. I started once upon a time in politics by being elected to the Greater Stockholm Council. And I was sitting in a couple of committees. Some of them were profoundly boring.
Most of them.
And I had absolutely no influence over anything because it was run by the local bureaucracy. But I did learn quite a number of things, also by challenging the local bureaucracy. And I did benefit from that when I was dealing with other issues later on. So I think that's... They even elected me to the local, whatever it was called, the church community leadership. So I had to distribute apartments between the priests. That is the... I learned a lot, but I later dealt with the Bosnian Civil War.
You were in a bunch of international meetings which were equally boring, I know. Martin
I
and
have
John.
no view on leadership, but I have 2 points on which I think we have touched on, but I think it's incredibly important upon structure. The first is, and it's often very difficult to rearrange this, but I think it's very difficult to govern a city well if it is not integrated with the city region of which it's part. And I can give many examples. I've thought about this a lot. So that, and I think, say, one of the big problems with New York City is the way it's structured. It's very difficult to change in its governance structured and divided among several states in itself. London, one of the problems with London now is that the Greater London area is much too small. We can't govern this as an integrated region. One of the reasons we can't solve the housing problem is because the regions where it could be solved aren't under its control. So city regions have to be governed as regions. And the second point, which was made very, very clear, but it's unbelievably important, is cities have to have the relevant powers to solve their problems. And the single most important one is to have tax revenue. And this is written, taxes are power. You fought a revolution here over it. For your mistaken attempt at independence. Never mind.
We would have voted to leave.
We won't go. We won't go there. So, national governments are very, very jealous of fiscal power.
Yes.
And in most countries that I know, Britain is extreme, but even here, far too much is concentrated at the national level. It's very difficult to make cities work well if you don't control the revenue, don't control the city region. Now, you talked about Mumbai. I know a bit about India because I worked on it. This is a monstrously big problem in Indian urban government because it's not the level at which planning occurs and it's not the level at which revenue is applied. Actually, the Chinese strangely do this better. So these structural questions are really important if we're going to get the future of cities to work.
John, final word.
I'll just associate myself with, in particular, the comments of Helen and also Martin. We have. I think cities, in many cases, now have the quality of leadership that's necessary to get the job done, and more importantly, in a way that they, by definition, remain closer to the people. The people look first. I'm amazed in the job that I now have, and I went straight into that job without having been in the city council and so on, but that they look first to the city to solve any problem. They're oblivious to and frankly frustrated by you telling them that some other level of government has responsibility for that. And so I think you have to stay close but look afar, back to our urban diplomacy point, because you have to figure out what is the best way to solve climate change, what is the best way to integrate refugees, what is the best way to build transit. And that's where I think the urban diplomacy comes in. A lot of that's not going to come from the other governments in your own country. And then I just think this massive fiscal imbalance has to be addressed. In our case, in our country, 8 cents on the dollar is actually collected by and the responsibility of cities when we have all of these responsibilities to do all these things and we have to rely on, I described myself as like a little boy in short pants having to go to the other governments and beg them for money to do things they and the people expect us to do. And that has to be addressed, and I don't know how that's going to be addressed. It's not a matter of who's in the office, it's a matter of these structures that probably aren't going to be changed anytime soon.
John, Martin, Eduardo, Helen, Carl, thanks so much for getting us started today. Terrific conversation. We will be heading to dinner around through the museum, up the stairs, and there will be folks letting you know how to get there. But again, thanks so much, and look forward to conversing more as we continue. Thanks.
This concludes the opening program of the forum. Thank you for your attendance. Please proceed to Griffin Court for the opening dinner. There will be staff to direct you along the way. We hope you enjoy your evening.